Hello, Heartsborn, Miss Burbage here. Today I'm going to start to read you a story. It's a Roald Dahl story, and it's called Esio, Trot. This is quite a long story, so I am going to read it to you over the course of 3 days. It does not comprise of any chapters, so I have divided into 3 sections. So I'm going to start off reading the preview of the book at the back. It is definitely one of my favourite Roald Dahl books, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So, Esio, Trot. So, Mr. Hoppy really loves his neighbour, Mrs. Silver, and Mrs. Silver really loves her tortoise, called Alfie. One day, Mrs. Silver asks Mr. Hoppy how to make Alfie grow, and suddenly, Mr. Hoppy knows the way to win her heart. With the help of a magical spell and some cabbage leaves, can Mr. Hoppy be happy at last? Alright. So let's make a start today on section 1. So, Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were 2 loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One was the flowers he grew on his balcony, and they were grown in pots and tubs and baskets, and in the summertime the little balcony became a riot of colour. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. His balcony belonged to an attractive, middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow, and she also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, and he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above and the other looking up, but was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies might not even been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like 1,000,000 miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. And as I said, he was a very, very shy man. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous, like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else, and that somebody was a small tortoise called Alfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments to Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt so jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant that Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived in her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balconies so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge, and in one corner there was a little house into which Alfie could crawl every night to keep warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl up in there and bury himself deep under the hay and to go asleep for months on end without food or water, and this is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Oh, welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how I have missed you!" It was times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and he become a tortoise. Now we came to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomatoes and a piece of crispy celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking very well this morning." "Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. Absolutely gorgeous, Mr. Hoppy said, and not really meaning it. And now, as he looked down on Mrs. Silver's smiling face, gazing up into his own, he thought for the thousandth time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. I do wish he would grow a little faster, Mrs. Silver was saying. Every spring when he wakes up for his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales, and do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he has not gained one single ounce, more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing. What does he weigh now? Mr. Hoppy asked her. Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered, about as much as a grapefruit. Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy said very seriously, but when they can live for 100 years, that's what's expected. I know that, Mrs. Silver said, but I do wish he could grow just a little bit bigger. He's such a tiny, wee fellow. He seems just fine as he is, Mr. Hoppy said. No, he's not just fine, Mrs. Silver said. Try to think how miserable it must make him to feel to be so titchy. Everybody wants to grow up. You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you? Mr. Hoppy said. And even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click. An amazing idea came rushing into his head. Of course I would, Mrs. Silver said. I'd give anything to make that happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here, surely, was his big chance. Grab it, he told himself. Grab it, quick. Mrs. Silver, he said, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want. You do, she cried. Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things? I worked in North Africa once, Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all the tortoises in England come from, and a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. Oh, please tell me, Mrs. Silver. I beg, Mrs. Silver, I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy, and I will be your slave for life. When he heard the words, your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you. And this is where I'm going to stop for today, Heartsborn. So we have finished section 1 of Esio Trot, and I will continue the story in the next video. Okay, so you're going to have to wait and see. I hope you have a lovely evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.